In the freezing dawn of February 2, 1502, 3 men watched in silence while 2 bodies moved on sheets soaked with sweat and blood. A notary wrote with a trembling hand. A physician took clinical notes. An emissary counted the hours. This was not a wedding, it was an audit. A documentation, a profanation disguised as diplomacy. Lucrezia Borgia, 22 years old, lay exhausted beneath Alfonso I's desk, Duke of Ferrara. It was the 3rd consummation of the night. Her thighs trembled. Her breathing was a muffled moan. Her nails dug into the sheets embroidered with the papal crest. But her eyes did not show surrender. They showed calculation. They say the body never lies, and Lucrezia's told a story no one in that room knew how to read. Her reddened skin spoke not of passion, but of endurance. Her bitten lips whispered not love, but strategy. Every moan documented by the witnesses was not pleasure, but survival turned into performance. She was no longer the girl her father had sold to the highest bidder. She was no longer the widow who had buried 2 husbands sacrificed for political convenience. She was no longer the woman who cried in private while smiling in public. All that remained was a duchess who had learned the single truth of power: if they are going to use your body as a battlefield, then make sure you win the war. At dawn, when the last witness signed the final document, when the proofs of consummation were sealed and sent to the Pope, when the men left the room satisfied with their records, Lucrezia slowly sat up, covered herself with a golden silk robe, and for the first time in her life, smiled without pretending. Because she had learned something none of the men in that room could imagine, that a woman documented like livestock can become the breeder who controls the entire herd. This is the story of the night that changed the map of Europe, not because of the alliances written on parchment, but because of the new kind of power born between stained sheets and silent witnesses. To understand how Lucrezia Borgia ended up in that room, watched like a breeding mare while 3 men documented her intimacy, we must return to the perfumed hallways of the Vatican, where her father was not only but the most successful trafficker of human flesh in all Christendom. Lucrezia was born on April 18, 1480, in Subiaco, daughter of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia and Venazia de Catania. It was not a birth, it was an investment. Rodrigo, the future Alexander VI, had already calculated that the women of his blood would be more useful than any army in the conquest of Italy. His daughter would not be raised for holiness, but for political seduction. From the age of 4, Lucrezia learned that her value was measured in ducats, alliances, and treaties. Her governess didn't teach her Latin to read scripture, but to understand the marriage contracts that would arrive year after year. By age 10 she spoke Italian, Spanish, French, and the most important language of all, calculated silence. Her beauty developed like a curse disguised as a blessing. Hair golden as papal treasure, skin white as the marble of St. Peter's, blue eyes that reflected both innocence and intelligence. Ambassadors who visited the Vatican didn't look at her as a child, they appraised her like a work of art soon to be auctioned. The first suitor came when Lucrezia was 11. Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, 30 years older, with breath that smelled of sour wine and hands that trembled more from vice than age. The wedding was held in 1493, when she had barely begun to menstruate. Her father gave her away as one signs a check, elegantly, without hesitation, already calculating the next transaction. But the marriage to Sforza turned out to be a poor investment. Giovanni was weak, cowardly, politically useless. Worse still, he did not consummate the marriage with the frequency the Borgias expected. Alexander VI needed grandchildren, needed heirs, needed his daughter's womb to produce soldiers for his cause. When it became clear that Giovanni was more ornament than function, annulment was inevitable. The accusation was brutal in its simplicity: impotence. At 16, Lucrezia had to declare before an ecclesiastical court that her husband could not fulfill his marital duties. The humiliation was public, documented, sealed with papal wax. Giovanni fled Rome swearing revenge, but it no longer mattered. Lucrezia had learned the first lesson of Borgia power: weak men are discarded like old clothes. The second marriage arrived in 1498. Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bouchalier, was everything Giovanni had not been: young, handsome, virginal, with royal Neapolitan blood. This time, Lucrezia fell in love. Alfonso was 18, angel-faced, gentle-mannered, a stark contrast to the brutality of the papal court. The consummation was genuine, passionate, documented by physicians who confirmed fertility in both spouses. For 2 years, Lucrezia experienced something close to happiness. Alfonso treated her like a woman, not an investment. He wrote her poems, walked with her through the Vatican gardens, whispered secrets only she was meant to hear. They had a son, Rodrigo, and for the first time in her life, Lucrezia believed love could coexist with politics. But the Borgias do not forgive unauthorized happiness. On July 15, 1500, Alfonso of Aragon was attacked by assassins on the steps of St. Peter's. The wounds were not fatal, but the recovery was. As he healed in his chambers under Lucrezia's care, someone entered one night and finished the job. The method: strangulation with a silk cord, the same material his wife used to adorn herself. Lucrezia found the body at dawn. She did not scream, she did not cry. She simply sat beside the corpse and stroked his cold face until the doctors arrived. That day she understood the second lesson of Borgia power: love is a luxury pawns cannot afford. Her father granted her 3 months of mourning. Then he presented her with a list of new suitors. In Alexander VI's world, a young widow was far too valuable a resource to waste on tears. The Vatican's audience hall looked like an auction house disguised as a chapel: incense, gold, marble, and sealed envelopes holding marriage offers from every corner of Europe. January 1502, and Lucrezia Borgia was officially back on the market. But this time, the conditions had changed. Alfonso I d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, was no ordinary noble. He was a military engineer, an expert artillerist, lord of one of the most prosperous cities in northern Italy. He was 35, had buried his first wife without drama, and handled both cannons and diplomacy with lethal precision. When his envoys arrived in Rome, they did not come to court, they came to negotiate. The conditions they imposed were unusual, even for Borgia standards. They demanded a dowry of 100,000 ducats, the fortress of Cento, the duchy of Nepi, and something more: absolute guarantee that the marriage would be consummated and documented under a protocol they themselves would dictate. They didn't want another annulment born from feigned impotence. They would accept no doubts about legitimacy. They wanted irrefutable proof. Alexander VI read the terms without blinking. His daughter was worth every ducat, every fortress, every paper they requested. Italy was fracturing between France and Spain, and Ferrara controlled the passage of the Po. An alliance with the d'Este family was not merely a marriage, it was survival. But when Lucrezia read the special clause, something hardened in her gaze. From the age of 4, Lucrezia Borgia learned that her value was not measured in childhood, dreams, or education, but in dowries, alliances, and political deals. Her tutors did not teach her Latin for scripture but for reading marriage contracts. By 10, she spoke several languages fluently: Italian, Spanish, French, and the most important one of all, calculated silence. Her beauty, praised by the world, quickly became her curse. Diplomats looked at her not as a child but as a valuable object to be traded. Her first marriage came at 11, to Giovanni Sforza, a man 30 years older. It was a political move, not a union. When he failed to produce heirs, the marriage was annulled, and Lucrezia, at 16, was forced to publicly declare his impotence. This humiliation taught her the first rule of Borgia power: weak men are disposable. Her second marriage, to Alfonso of Aragon, brought rare happiness. He was young, kind, and she truly loved him. They had a son, and for a moment she believed she could live beyond politics. But the Borgia machine crushed her joy. Alfonso was attacked and later strangled while recovering. Lucrezia learned her second lesson: love is a luxury the powerful cannot afford. A third marriage was arranged, this time to Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara. His conditions were harsh, an enormous dowry, lands, and a requirement that the marriage be consummated multiple times before official witnesses. It was a public invasion of her private life, reducing her body to evidence. Yet Lucrezia transformed humiliation into strength. She and Alfonso formed a strategic partnership, not based on romance but on mutual respect and intelligence. Over time, she became a powerful duchess, diplomat, and political force, proving that even in a world determined to use her, Lucrezia Borgia learned how to use the world instead.